Just give us 1 second. It's just getting ready. All right, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another of our really interesting people that we try to have a conversation with on a Sunday morning. We know that for many people, you're starting to get ready for Pesach, so we hope that even if you are in the process of cleaning or getting ready, you can at least play this in the
Did we lose Rabbi Korobkin, or that's me?
No, I don't hear him either.
Rabbi Korobkin, I think we lost you. Okay. Hopefully Rabbi Korobkin will come back. But I guess it's because it seems like we're live. So welcome, Professor Seidman. I'm really excited to have you on because I started a series. Oh, Rabbi Korobkin's back here. You're muted, Rabbi Korobkin.
Sorry about that, folks. Let me just add myself. Okay,
Welcome
so
back.
Sorry. Sometimes the internet does that. So Rabbi Lesher recently, as he was probably starting to say, recently gave a series on the Besa Yaakov movement, the history and the evolution of the Besa Yaakov movement and how revolutionary it was for its time in the beginning of the 20th century. And Professor Seidman wrote a fascinating book documenting this story and the Sarah Schneer movement. And so we're very honored that not only did she agree to be part of our discussion this morning, but we're delighted to welcome her to Toronto. And I'll just quickly go over just a brief bio, and then we'll pass it over to Rabbi Lesher. Naomi Seidman is the Chancellor Jackman Professor of the Arts in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at the University of Toronto, and a 2016 Guggenheim Fellow. Her publications include The Marriage Plot, or How Jews Fell in Love and with Literature, and Sarah Schneer and the Bais Yaakov Movement, A Revolution in the Name of Tradition, which won a National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies. She is presently working on a study of Freud in Hebrew and Yiddish translation. She grew up in a Hasidic community in Brooklyn, and we look forward to hearing more about that as well. And it's really an honor to welcome you, Professor Seidman. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rabbi Lesher, let me
Sure.
pass over the mic to you.
So one of the reasons that we had Professor Seidman on, not only is she a professor at the University of Toronto, but she wrote this fantastic book that I have here, Sarah Schneer and the Bais Yaakov Movement. And I know that not everyone has read the book, so I would love to hear more about the book. And we're also, God willing, going to get to the Bais Yaakov project, which is something that I'm sure Professor Seidman will tell you about, which is a fantastic resource which I used for my recent lecture on the movement. So before we get involved in the scholarly side of your life, maybe Professor Seidman, you could help us understand a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your story, and what drew you to the story of the Bais Yaakov movement in the first place.
Thank you so much. Did somebody just ask a question in the chat or just spelling my name?
No,
anyway, yeah, so I grew up in Borough Park. My parents are both Holocaust survivors. Both of them were very involved in Bais Yaakov. They actually met through Bais Yaakov in a DP camp and then in Paris. My father was a Yiddish journalist. He wrote for a number of mostly Orthodox Yiddish newspapers, but also secular ones. He came from a Hasidic home, and there was a real, let's say Hasidish flavor in our house, but basically my whole family has ended up what I would call now yeshivish, black hat, maybe just 2 inches to the right of you guys looking from appearances.
Appearances can be deceiving.
Yeah, who knows? I don't know. I no longer can judge. I myself went to Bais Yaakov, and all my sisters did. As I said, my father was the president of the board of Bais Yaakov, and I'm OTD. I went off the derech when I was 18, and became a professor, and basically almost didn't write at all about the Orthodox world. I don't know why. I mean, I just didn't feel like I had any kind of expertise in that. My basic field was literature. I wrote about Hebrew and Yiddish literature, which is basically a secular field. And then I taught for many years at a sort of divinity school in Berkeley, California. And in 2010, I brought a group of 10 students, most of them not Jewish, to Krakow for the Jewish Culture Festival. And I was in the shul of the Ramah, and it's interesting, the Poles say the Ramu, which is like more Galicianer than the Jews that I know. And I happened to notice a group of Bais Yaakov girls. I can tell Bais Yaakov girls from a mile off. And I asked them what they were doing, whether they were in town for the festival. And they said that they were there to visit the grave of the woman who founded the movement. And I think they were very surprised when I said, oh, Sarah Schneerer. And later as I was walking back to my hotel, I bumped into the director of the festival, and he asked me how I was enjoying it. And I still had these Bais Yaakov girls on my mind. And I said, did you know that this woman, Sarah Schneerer, is buried in Krakow, and these Bais Yaakov girls come, as far as I could see, they were unchaperoned, come to pay tribute to her at her grave. And he said he had no idea, and he invited me to come back to the festival the next year and give a talk about Bais Yaakov, which I did. I was very happy to be on the inside of the festival as opposed to just another tourist. And there was a woman in the audience when I gave my talk who said, I would like to publish a book about this topic. So suddenly I was writing a book about Bais Yaakov, and it brought me, back to a lot of things about my own history. I learned so much about my parents that I didn't quite understand, including the fact that my father had actually written the first book about Sarah Schneerer, published in 1936. So there are now two biographies. Well, there's Pearl Banish's, but aside from that one, there are two Bais Yaakov, Sarah Schneerer biographies, both of them written by Seidmans.
Wow. So it was like a returning, in a certain sense, for you to your father's scholarship, and also a little bit to your past.
Yes, very much so.
I would love to talk about that transition that you made about, as you call it, off the derech, but maybe before we get to that, what I find so, I think, impactful in your writing, first of all, you write very, very passionately about the topic, but sometimes when you get, an academic work, they often will discuss a work that, and almost as an outsider. And while that is valuable and you can have more of an objective feel on some level, what I found about your work, which is so endearing, is that you get the sense that, and this is because you went to Bais Yaakov, that you understand it as an insider as well as a historian. So I think with that, I guess I would ask you, as an insider and then studying it more in depth, what was surprising to you about the Bais Yaakov movement that you had not known that your research really uncovered?
Well, thank you for that question. It's interesting. There are things that you don't know, and now I'm also writing a book about Freud, so that's important for that. But I knew Sarah Schneerer was more interesting than the kind of not cartoon, but very simple picture that I was given of her. I just felt that. And I think other people felt that too, So learning more about Sarah Schneerer was definitely very interesting, and also just understanding how radical Bais Yaakov was. When you go to I went to Bais Yaakov in Borough Park, which is, in some ways the Brooklyn heart of the movement. It's not in the wild fringes of Bais Yaakov, let's say, where what you might imagine is a little different in the peripheries of the system. And I just thought of it as a very conservative place that I didn't feel inclined to research, really, and then somehow something about seeing those girls out there traveling on their own reminded me that when I was a Bais Yaakov girl, I also traveled on my own, and the place wasn't as conservative as I remembered, as I sort of stereotyped it in my own mind. And something about, my mother and her there was something about Bais Yaakov that was pioneering and radical in its origins that somehow I felt beneath the surface, and of what was in many ways a very, conservative, ultra-Orthodox, you can say. I don't like to use that term. Ultra sounds like way too Orthodox, right? But, strictly Orthodox, I guess you could say. That something revolutionary about it that appealed to me, just as the person that I am. I'm sure there are other people that would be attracted to other aspects of the movement, but I was very interested in those parts of it that didn't really fit into a kind of stereotype of what Orthodox girlhood was, or Orthodox womanhood was, or what, education could be. And the more I found out about it, the more I realized that it was really that Sarah Schneer wasn't the woman that I think she was made out to be in my Bais Yaakov education, that my mother's adventures in Bais Yaakov were my mother has an adventurous spirit, and I kind of felt that and saw that. And it wasn't just my mother, it was other people. I mean, there's a kind of memory of those early years that survived, at least into my childhood. And I think it still does. And I think it's still feeding the movement, along with all the what could be considered more conservative elements. And just as an example, when I went to Bais Yaakov, the big thing was production, which I don't know if you know the word production. It's like a Bais Yaakov word. Yes, my father. Yes, exactly. That's my father. Thank you for mentioning him. I loved him very much, and I think about him all the time. So production was just, and our brothers would make fun of, production, the girls and their production. And I was very interested to learn that production was, I have a poster of a quote unquote Bais Yaakov production from 1926. So this goes way back. And it's a poster. It's not just it's a public poster on the street that says, Eingang nur für Frauen. So, entry just for women. So these elaborate, what could be called amateur theater that's purely female, put on by women, for women, or by girls, for women, though often there are women in the play too. I just went to a Bais Yaakov play in the Orthodox neighborhood a couple of weeks ago, and there were some adult women in the production too, and it was an incredibly elaborate production with 3 stages and a whole bunch of crew working on the sides, and that was there right from the very start. So just learning that theater, which and what could be called amateur theater, that is not a variation on what maybe what you could think of as kind of boys theater in the yeshiva world, the Purim spiel, etc. Really its own thing, even performed at a different time of year, typically around Hanukkah, though this one was around Purim. So these were all things that were both new and interesting, fascinating to me. And also I had somehow felt that they existed under the surface of my own Bais Yaakov education. And they just brought to light something that I didn't know I knew.
Professor Seidman, for those who aren't that familiar with the history of the Bais Yaakov movement, perhaps you can reflect on what was so revolutionary and radical about the founding of the movement.
So Bais Yaakov, I think if people might be interested or surprised to hear that although within the more modern German Orthodoxy, neo-Orthodoxy, it's sometimes called, of the Samson Raphael Hirsch style, there were schools that were actually co-ed schools for boys and girls starting from the 1850s, 1860s, I think, that in the more traditional Eastern European Polish society, there was no Orthodox organized school system for Orthodox girls until 1916, 1917. It was halakhically considered problematic because of the line in the, I believe it's in the Mishnah, expanded in the Talmud by Rabbi Eliezer, Kolam Lamed Torah Levito Ke'ilu L'Ndat Tiflut. Sorry about my moving back and forth between Ashkenazic and Sephardic pronunciation. This is what happens when you go to graduate school in Hebrew, which means that teaching girls Torah is like teaching them licentiousness, whatever that means. It's a complicated thing, but it problematizes organized Torah study for girls. And even though it was understood that something needed to be done about a wave of defections around the turn of the century and the first years of the 20th century, there were some very famous defections by Orthodox Jewish girls from their traditional homes, including some very painful ones to the Orthodox community, the granddaughters of the sons of Rebbe. And this was something that was much more common among girls than boys. So OTD was a female phenomenon during those years, and particularly centered around Krakow. And something needed to be done, but because of this halachic prohibition and because of the way the Orthodox world is, the politics of Orthodoxy, you might say, where the necessity of doing something that might be considered non-traditional runs up against the pressure, let's say from the right, for rabbis not to seem to be capitulating to modernity, even as they're facing its challenges. It created a kind of paralysis in the male Orthodox establishment that made it so that nothing happened, despite the fact that people understood that something needed to be done. And even the halachic way to deal with this, which was basically to say, Torah Sheba'al Peh is only for boys, so the Talmud is only for boys. That's strictly forbidden in the Besa Yaakov curriculum, though it's a little squishy around the edges, because what do you do about rabbinic commentary on the Torah? But the Bible is permitted, and not only that, but you get this other principle, which is called Hara'at Sha'ah, the needs of the hour, which makes it possible to go around what seems like a clear halachic prohibition when it's a kind of emergency. So the way was paved for halachic for halachic permission to create girls' schools, but for mostly political reasons, it was impossible for a man to step out and do it. It was done by German Jewish educators in Lithuania and in Warsaw, but in Krakow, it was Sarah Schneerer who started the girls' school system on her own. And I'll point out that the Mishnah says, Kol Hamlamed Torah Levito, which seems to be talking about a father, at least a man. So there's no halachic prohibition apparently for a woman to do it. So Sarah Schneerer was able to be active where no man was. She had no real reputation to defend. She was a nobody. She was known as the divorcee in the streets of Krakow. She had sort of negative status. And she started a school in her dressmaker studio, and then basically created a chain of schools before the school system was officially taken over by the sort of German Jewish wing of Agudas Yisrael, the organized political movement of Orthodox Jews. She had already established 44 schools on her own. So it's quite an amazing story of how one woman working almost entirely on her own was able to create a school system in Poland that was eventually to be, I think, the largest school system when you add the sort of male counterpart to it in interwar Poland, and the largest Jewish school system.
I want to ask a
Rabbi Lesher.
follow-up question. Yeah. Oh, so that was just, yeah, it's an incredible story of, a woman who, as you point out in your book, had the benefit of marginality, right? The fact that she was a woman, which I thought was one of the most brilliant suggestions in your book, that just particularly she was successful because she was a woman and she didn't have to make those political ties, and she was outside of the framework of, those sort of established social quotas. I wanted to ask you, you did mention in your explanation that this concept of the OTD, which is, I guess, a modern term, I think it's maybe in the 90s, the Jewish Observer, coined the term. But there was definitely defection. And I think number one, just from a historical perspective, a lot of people may be surprised at that, because we think of the old, the shtetl as like the olden days and the good old days, and no, there was no OTD in the shtetl. So that, number one, I wanted to, I guess, hear your thoughts on that, and obviously dispelling the myth, but maybe we can understand better why there was defection. And secondly, as is clear from the history, as you mentioned, this was a female phenomenon. And I have seen some theories. Some want to argue it had a lot to do with the arranged marriages that women felt constrained by. But certainly, it's remarkable that there were so many female women leaving the fold when you have their male counterparts staying in, whereas women had much, I would imagine, less social freedoms and less ability to sort of forge their own path. It just, to me, I would want to know why, if you have any theories as to why it was a female phenomenon when men would probably be, at least freer, socially to be forged their own path.
Yeah, it might seem that way, but in fact, well, there's a number of reasons, and I'll just say that I just want to, give credit where credit is due. The notion of the benefits of marginality is something that the Israeli literary critic Iris Parush uses to talk about why women were more likely to secularize during the 19th century. She's a 19th century historian, and that had to do with the fact that the women were, because of the, let's say, economic distribution of labor in the shtetl, women were more likely, it was very common for a family to own a store, right, in the marketplace, where the husband would be sitting with a Gemara and learning, and a customer would come in and he'd say, wait for my wife to come back. So the woman would have a kind of ability to function in the marketplace in ways that men often weren't, because their time was devoted, in the Orthodox world, was devoted to Torah study in a way that women's wasn't. So that's, Iris Parush says that. Rachel Manikin, who writes specifically about this wave of defections, talks about a law that goes back to the late 19th century in which public school was required, a law of compulsory education. And when the Habsburg Empire, Galicia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when the empire instituted this compulsory education law, there weren't immediately enough schools for all the children that needed to be educated. And the Orthodox world basically decided to send the girls first. In other words, protect the boys who were obligated to study Torah, and send the girls who, anyway, maybe it's a good idea they learn a little Polish, because later in life when they're managing the stores, that would come in handy. So girls were sent to school for 8 years. That was the compulsory education. That was actually Sarshner's, the sum total of her education. And during these 8 years, they learned Polish, and they started to read literature, and they basically fell in love with the heroes of Polish novels. And when it was their time to be set up on a date to marry a chassid or yeshiva bacher, they weren't interested. In other words, their education had sort of ruined them for arranged marriage. And this was a crisis during these years. The Ger Rebbe is reputed to have said that he had 2,000 bachelor chassidim and no hope to find brides for them. The girls would run away on the eve of their arranged marriage. And actually this kind of what you might call an imbalance in the marriage market. So there are more men than women looking for an Orthodox mate which it's now, as we know, it's the opposite now.
Right.
Yeah,
And that's partly because
ironic.
of the success of Bais Yaakov. And I mean, there are other factors, but so the fact that there were more girls willing to, do crazy things, to run away from an arranged marriage, meant that women in some ways had power, and that when Sarah Schneer, the women who remained had a kind of power because of their scarcity in the marriage market. And that's another reason why Sarah Schneer was successful. And I'll just say that the last reason, you didn't exactly ask me that, is that the symbolic power of having a girls' school movement headed by a woman was also, I think, tremendously appealing and attractive to girls who would have been less excited to have a bunch of, men doing this to them, wagging their fingers at them Sarah Schneer did plenty of finger wagging, I will freely admit, but she also was in it for herself. As one of the things that I discovered is that she was incredibly lonely. To be a passionately religious Hasidic woman at her time and in her environment was incredibly lonely. Even her own siblings and her immediate friends were nowhere near as religious as she was. And Bais Yaakov in some way provided her with a world in which she could live and flourish.
Interesting.
Wow. So thank you for describing really what the success of Sarah Schneer and the movement really, hinged on a lot of factors. You mentioned the Aguda's involvement later, and you also mentioned, this marginality, and also a woman leading a women's movement. I guess my question is, we know the Bais Yaakov movement has, as you mentioned earlier, evolved over time, and they do sort of pay tribute to Sarah Schneer, as part of this story of their movement. And I guess I want to know, in what ways has it changed? Obviously, in the in the post-war years, there was a different flavor to the movement. But how, in what ways has the movement changed? And almost like the production example that you give, it almost appears as though there's a sort of window in time in which, Bais Yaakov has these productions. Then they're preparing, their graduates to get married or to live sort of a more conservative, lifestyle without, they're not really engaging in plays and in production as much in their older years. Has that ever caused a tension in the movement? Embracing sort of the theater, embracing the more revolutionary aspects of it in more modern times?
Yeah, I'm not sure that theater has been, there are all kinds of ways in which what we could call the conservatism of the movement and the revolutionary character of the movement are in tension with each other. But I think some of those are, Bais Yaakov, Sarah Schneer's fame far exceeds Bais Yaakov. I don't think people realize that. There was just a comic book that came out in Poland called Sarah Imenu about Sarah Schneer that's being distributed in Polish. And there's no Bais Yaakov in Poland today. So Sarah Schneer, the ways in which she's understood to be a feminist outside of Bais Yaakov is deeply distressing to Bais Yaakov. And that's a point of tension. The other point of tension is, so you can find Jewish observers in the 1990s where there are articles, this is called Bais Yaakov revisionism, where people are just like, Sarah Schneer was no feminist, let me repeat this. So modern Orthodox women studying Talmud or doing prayer circles or whatever it is they're doing irritates the Bais Yaakov establishment no end. One of the ways to really see this the most clearly is that Bais Yaakov in the interwar period was basically a Baal Tshuva movement, a movement to attract people to Orthodoxy. And people are sometimes surprised to hear this because most of its students came from Hasidic homes, at least in the beginning of Bais Yaakov. The big Ger Hasidism, which was the largest Hasidic group in Poland, 250,000 people, the Ger Rebbe was really the earliest major supporter of Bais Yaakov and happily sent his the daughters of the Hasidim there. So Bais Yaakov was a Hasidic movement that was nevertheless a Baal Teshuva movement, by which I mean that even if you had grown up in a Gerer home in the 1920s, you still needed to be attracted back to the Orthodox world. Something had gone wrong in the delivery system, in what could be called the cultural transmission of traditional Judaism. There was just a kind of gap. And a Baal Teshuva movement, as we know, requires a certain kind of, appeal to the outsider, right? To the outsider, you stress the enthusiasm. You don't immediately start with the rules. It's not like that in Bais Yaakov today. Bais Yaakov today, I think there's a term for it, like a rear guard. The term escapes me. I don't think I've ever actually used it, but it's a movement that tries to retain as opposed to attract. It doesn't, except in the peripheries. And there is actually a Bais Yaakov in Buenos Aires, which has 5 Bais Yaakovs, people might be surprised to hear, which directly appeals to a Baal Teshuva population. I don't know, do people in this room know what Baal Teshuva is? I don't need to explain that, right?
Yeah, I mean, just for thoroughness, I mean, most people do, but the Baal Teshuva movement that we know of in our own lifetime started really mostly in the 60s and 70s, like
Right.
Eish HaTorah and Or Sameach, and it was really geared exclusively towards people who were unaffiliated Jews, because there was the perception was that Orthodox Jews didn't need to have outreach applied to them. I think I see so much irony in how history repeats itself, because sort of the whole Kiruv movement, the whole outreach movement today is readjusting to look inwards into Orthodox families now, because there are more and more kids, more and more young people who are leaving their Orthodox homes, and people who would traditionally have done Kiruv to unaffiliated Jews are starting to realize that we need to focus inwards. It sounds very much like what the Bais Yaakov movement was about back then.
And one way of understanding, and now if your family has a TV, you won't be allowed to enroll your daughter in most of the Bais Yaakovs in Brooklyn, let's just say. So this is a gatekeeping kind of thing. And I think actually this is one of the services that OTD people do to the Orthodox world. I know that they cause a lot of pain. I'm not, I'm very well aware of the pain that I myself caused to my family. You ruin the prospects of a good shidduch for your younger sibling. I mean, all of that, and then breaking your parents' hearts. But that, along with that, is actually a kind of service, which is that you remind the Orthodox world that appealing to its young people is a value. And digging deep for those sources of spirituality and enthusiasm, and not just rule keeping, etc. And that's what happened with Bais Yaakov in the early years. And just as evidence of one very clear way in which it's very different from Bais Yaakov today is that when you graduated from the seminary, you were not allowed to go home on the way to your first post, because the worry was that you'd go home and your parents would try to find you a match. And there was too great a need for labor in this, Ponzi scheme, rapidly expanding system. There weren't enough teachers for all the demand. And so the idea was you postpone marriage and you give those years, and you create a kind of extended adolescence of travel and entrepreneurship and study that allows you in some ways to thrive outside of the role of wife and mother, which now, as we know, there's more and more pressure to marry early. There's this problem of the age gap, and there's the pressure to be richer and thinner and graduate from a seminary and have a great CV, a shidduch resume, or whatever it's called. The attention is almost completely on the services that you provide to the community as a wife and mother. And in the early years, it very much was a kind of a period of freedom as an unattached woman. I mean, Sarah Schneerer had a cohort of unattached adolescent women, even women in their early 20s, she traveled with, who were the kind of elite battalion of her, of her great project. And that really doesn't exist, even though there are some remnants of it, including what I saw in Krakow, which is this girls traveling on their own. The freedom that comes from really tight networks that can connect transnationally across the globe, where you can just go from, one frum neighborhood to another, or even in Poland, where there really isn't such a thing as a frum neighborhood exactly, but just networks of tight bonds that are not the usual traditional forms of kinship. You're not visiting your in-laws. You're staying along Bais Yaakov routes. And that's what Sarah Schneer, continues to do for Bais Yaakov. It's interesting. She loved to travel and she loved pilgrimage. She instituted all these pilgrimage rituals for Bais Yaakov. And now she herself has become a site of pilgrimage herself. And on almost any night of the year, you can find a group of Bais Yaakov girls or alums hanging out around her caver in Krakow. There's tons of cell phone videos all over the internet of girls dancing or saying Tehillim or singing around her gravestone, reconstructed by Bais Yaakov alumni in 2005. So she still,
I want to make sure I
after her
understand
death,
you.
still provides a service almost 90 years later.
I'd like to make sure I understand what you said. Are you suggesting that during Sarah Schneer's lifetime and shortly thereafter, there was less emphasis placed for the students to get married and be good mothers and wives for their husbands?
Yes. The basic, there's very little talk in the discourse of Bais Yaakov in the interwar period about women as wives and mothers, in part because of the kind of slight embarrassment about Sarah Schneer's own status as a divorcee, and in part because it really was aiming to attract and appeal to young girls and women through a discourse of pioneering sisterhood, which involved travel and education and hiking and connecting with God on the top of mountains. And it did not try to appeal. I won't say it's absent, but it's much less emphasized. And this discourse of women supporting men who sit and learn developed in the 1950s in the around starting mostly, you can say, around Bnei Barak, the circles of the Chazon Ish, and who had a connection to Bais Yaakov, who helped found certain Bais Yaakov institutions for refugees from Nazi Europe and other places. And Rabbi Wolf, by Avram Yitzchak, he had another name, I forget his second first name.
Was it Avram Zev?
Avram Zev Wolf, or maybe you're thinking Zev because of Wolf.
I don't know.
I forget, it might be. So a disciple of the Chazon Ish, a German Jew who was I don't know, people know that sort of the Eastern European rabbis kind of outsourced Bais Yaakov to their, it's pasnished for an Eastern European Rosh Hashiva or, Hasidic Rabbi to be too involved in Bais Yaakov. They tended to outsource to the German doctor rabbis anything to do with women, so they don't have to look at women or talk to women. And he really instituted a new ideology for what a Bais Yaakov woman was, and he's sometimes credited, I don't know if credited, if I should be using that word, with founding what Menachem Friedman calls the Chevrat Lomdim, the Society of Learners. This idea that almost any man, unless he's really very unfortunately ungifted, should be sitting and learning for at least some period after his marriage. And obviously, this is a system that requires willing girls, young women, willing to marry these men with such ambitions. And this practice in its full, which was not common in Eastern Europe, right? It was only an elite of men who had the capacity to devote themselves full time to Torah study. the Chevrat Lomdim depended on Beis Yaakov, and it specifically depended on a movement that began in Beis Yaakov of Bnei Barak, where this idea of that the ideal was that you find a man who sits and learns, and it spread from Bnei Barak to the rest of it, the land of Israel, the rest of Israel, and then to the United States, and is now, a big part of what Beis Yaakov is, the understanding that, the top choice that you can have of a match is a man who sits and learns, and that you will somehow support him, which was possible also partly thanks to Bais Yaakov, which was expanding at such a rapid clip during these years. And Bais Yaakov teachers also taught at other kinds of day schools, some of them not even Orthodox, all over the United States. And when you have the day school movement expanding at such a rate, almost any serious Bais Yaakov girl could find a job inside the system. And with the Israeli government partly funding, the Chinuch Atzmai school system. So one of the things I'm pointing out is that Bais Yaakov may seem as if it's only about girls, but it's also about boys. It may seem like it's only about girls, but it's also about women. And it may seem like it's only about study, but it's also about economics. And it's an ecosystem that we're talking about. And Bais Yaakov is now part of a different ecosystem that has its roots in Bnei Barak of the 1950s.
I want to give you a chance, if you'd like, to show some of your slides, and also if you want to talk a little bit about this Bais Yaakov project that you've launched, and to give our audience an opportunity to hear about that. There's so much more to discuss, and I just want to give you that opportunity.
Sure, thank you. Maybe I'll say something about the Bais Yaakov project. And I'm sure people have questions. No, when are we almost done? 11:30, we're thinking?
Yeah.
So the Bais Yaakov, so one of the things about Canada, as I found, is that the government really supports research in the humanities much more generously than the United States. So I applied for when I got here, I was encouraged to apply for what's called the SSHRC grant, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This is where you guys should burst into "Oh Canada." And I got, having written my book with maybe a $2,000 American dollar scholarship research fund in my previous institution, I now have a $200,000 research grant.
Wow.
Which allows me to, basically do, I can't spend any of it on myself, but I can spend it on trips to Poland and Israel, and I'm making a record of Bais Yaakov music of the 1920s and 30s with Basia Schechter, who's another OTD Bais Yaakov Borough Park alum. And right now in Poland, I have a colleague, Pearl Gluck, who's a filmmaker, also OTD, also from Bais Yaakov Borough Park. Both of them are significantly younger than I am, but it turns out there is a lot of people who went to Bais Yaakov Borough Park who are out there in the world trying to make their living as an artist. And we're making a documentary about Sarah Schneer, which is very expensive, and my research fund doesn't cover anything. So if there are any rich people who want to support a documentary about Bais Yaakov, Pearl Gluck is right now following a group of Bais Yaakov girls to Sarah Schneer's grave, as well as many other important sites of Bais Yaakov history and just Jewish history in general. So there's that going on. And I also have a website called the Bais Yaakov Project. So if you just Google the Bais Yaakov Project, I'm basically trying to provide a digital platform that does, among other things, counts every Bais Yaakov school in the world. Where right now, it's not entirely clear. It's a little bit of a fuzzy boundary, what constitutes a Bais Yaakov school. They're not all called Bais Yaakov. But we now are at over 1,300 schools with addresses and photos and how many students, et cetera. So no one has tried to do this before. There's no central office of Bais Yaakov. So we're the only game in town in terms of Bais Yaakov history. As many photos, if anybody has family photos, we will gladly digitize them and put in as much information as we can. So let me show you a little bit of just some slides I have.
While you're bringing that up, Professor, are you
Yeah.
getting any pushback from I guess the official movement because you're OTD and they would prefer if you did not do this kind of thing?
So when I was, we actually got more pushback. I actually got more pushback when I was researching Bais Yaakov than after my book came out. So I was in contact with the Bais Yaakov archive in Jerusalem, and they were setting me up with a research assistant there who would digitize material and send it to me. And I was planning on making a trip to go look at stuff myself, run by Esther Farbstein. And she must have learned something about me, which I don't, as you can see, I don't try to hide. I thought about trying to hide it, but I know the Orthodox world too well, and everybody would find out very quickly. So I say it right away in my book, but she found out, and I got, my access was cut off. And but since my book came out, I've actually, I think people have seen who I am, that it's possible. I think the stereotype of OTD people is that we hate Orthodox Jews, we're just out to destroy them or expose their evil ways or whatever it is that people consider OTD to be. And that somebody could read an OTD book and learn something from it and consider that not only was I respectful, but that I very clearly am in love with Sarah Schneer, or whatever you want to call it, and you know, very interested in this from a, in some ways, a pure place, maybe a pure place that's hard for Orthodox Jews to understand. But you know, my
Well, it
mother
definitely
was
comes
really,
through. It definitely comes through in the book. Your love definitely comes through in the book, and I will tell you that very prestigious Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University have read this book and have praised it. So you know, there's definitely a clear, I would say, as I mentioned, the love comes through in the books to the readers.
Thank you so much. I mean, it was true. I basically, you know, one of the stories I sometimes tell is I was researching, you know, I was reading, I was in the YIVO archives reading microfiche Bais Yaakov journals, freezing in the archives, and a little bit, you know, irritated because I'm reading them on microfiche, and it's, you know, scratchy old Yiddish, and it's a little pious for my taste, to be 100% honest. And I see a notice, a gathering to say Tehillim for Sarah Schneer, and my heart started beating. And I looked at the date, and I realized, Sarah Schneer, she's already sick. This is already, you know, this was my first glimmer that we were near the end. And I had a physical reaction, and I started scrolling like very quickly through the microfiche, and then I got to the black bordered, the dates, just like a total black page. And I started crying. And it was a room full of people with their, you know, research. And someone sitting next to me was actually a frum guy. And he says, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Sarah Schneer died." He must have thought I was crazy. I was actually crying because Sarah Schneer died in 1935. So yes, there was, I think, part of what I mean, I don't think this was a conscious mission, but part of this was to a little bit try to make a bridge between OTD people and the frum world, to maybe let them know, or you know, that we don't hate, or at least not all of us hate Orthodoxy, that some of us feel deeply connected to many parts of it. And I think my mother finally got that. You know, my family finally got that. It was a way to understand that. My mother was so, I wanted to dedicate the book to my mother, and my mother refused. She was really nervous about, you know, I was going to write some feminist book that was going to, I don't know, say what about Bais Yaakov, and she didn't want anything to do with it. She was very nervous. And like, you know, a few months, I gave her a copy of the book. It got borrowed, quote unquote, by one of, you know, my many siblings and nieces and nephews. And then she's like, "Yeah, I need another one. Someone took it." And I had to keep giving her books because people in the family would, quote unquote, borrow it and not return it. And then my mother said, "Oh, the Rebbitzin likes your book." So suddenly I'm kosher. And that's a huge relief, because I didn't censor myself to any great extent that I was aware of. Maybe a sentence or two I softened. And I really have come to see that the Orthodox world is less is hungry, is thirsty for academic understandings of its past, is not wedded to only the art scroll cleaned up version of who Sarah Schneer was. So that was very moving for me to see. And I have to say that somehow I lost my power. Oh, here it is. Okay.
I want to thank you so much for being so open. I wanted to just reflect, if I may be so bold, I think
Please.
building bridges between, let's call, I don't even like the term OTD, but you know, building bridges is maybe something that in a very deep way you connected with in Sarah Schneer, because Sarah Schneer would maybe she would say we are in need of a new movement today. We need to connect to people who don't, let's say, fit into this very narrow box that they've been given. And I think she would you know, be completely on board with this mission that you have, which I think is a very very important and certainly necessary, crucial piece. So I also personally resonated with that. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. I hope that too. I mean, I know Sarah Schneer wouldn't approve of me. I'm not deluded, but I wrote in the book.
Who knows?
I wrote in the book that in some way that I hope she wouldn't entirely disapprove of, she brought me back, you know, she also, there I went, Ashkenazic pronunciation. You know, she brought the heart of this daughter back to her mother. So I just have to show a few images because I love these images so much. So here, you can see I gave a talk at the Riverdale Jewish Center, but sorry, it doesn't have here's the synagogue of the Ramah and the grave of Sarah Schneer. Here's the book about the Orthodox girls who ran away in Galicia in the turn of the century. There's a picture of a group of basically prostitutes, also turn of the century, being taken to Buenos Aires. That was another quote unquote destination for these runaway daughters, is into what was then called the international white slave trade. Mm-hmm. This is actually an important part of Bais Yaakov history, but this is the 1903 rabbinic conference where the rabbis understood the necessity of founding a girls' school system, but were unable to make it happen.
And that's Berta Pappenheim, right?
That's Berta Pappenheim. She was a feminist who became a co-worker with Leo Deutschlander, the main fundraiser for Bais Yaakov. And the reason why the international white slave trade is important to the history of Bais Yaakov is that Bais Yaakov basically fundraised and got support from the feminists and women, the suffragists all around the world trying to fight the international white slave trade. They basically marketed themselves as a response to this, you know, desecration of God's name. And for instance, the Bais Yaakov letterhead in Vienna and London said, Bais Yaakov Organization for the Education and Protection of Eastern European Girls and Women. Protection was code word for anti-prostitution. The letterhead in London had a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was on the international board of Bais Yaakov, about how great Bais Yaakov is. And people want to know, why would Eleanor Roosevelt care about women's Torah study? And this is one of the most surprising things I discovered in my research, is that it basically was intimately connected with, not in Poland, where the word prostitution was not mentioned, I can assure you, but elsewhere in Western Europe and North America, it was very tightly connected with the Jewish and non-Jewish fight against the international sex traffic. Here's an image of Sarah Schneer, and notice that was the spirit of Sarah Schneer in not allowing her image to be shown. People always say she was too modest to have her picture shown. No, that's not what she says in her diary and elsewhere. She thought she was ugly. Instead, so as a compromise to her sensibilities, even though I don't believe she's ugly, I do show her photo, which emerged from the archives about 15 years ago, but very, very small. And instead I show the drawing that circulated during her lifetime.
Dr.
Um,
Seidman,
yes.
I mean, this we could go on for at least another hour, and maybe we should have another session on this.
Should I stop the share?
I don't know. I just want to make sure that we have enough time in case. I really wanted to ask you a question, and maybe I don't know how long it'll take for you to answer this. Number one, do you still consider yourself a Bais Yaakov girl? And number two, is there anything that you miss about being part of the Orthodox community?
Oh, thank you so much for asking those questions. I think part of what happened with this project is my reclaiming my status as a Bais Yaakov girl. And also, I know that I had that same effect on quite a few other OTD Bais Yaakov girls. For a while, we have a little choir called the Kol Isha Choir. Excuse the what's the word? The
Reverence.
the irreverence. Thank you. My English is not so good. No, excuse the irreverence, but my excuse for the irreverence is that I was plenty irreverent when I was in Bais Yaakov too. And the Kol Isha Choir, we realized that there's a very deep part of us. Basia Schechter, she's a world musician. We got together, a group of us, mostly OTD singers, and had a basically a kumsitz, and it was so deep and so powerful for all of us to realize how much we got, how much of our spiritual lives we owe to Sarah Schneer and the movement that she started. And what do I miss? I miss that moment in your life, the delay of marriage, the opening up of adolescence, which came from girls marrying at 18 as opposed to 15 or 14, historical developments that precedes Bais Yaakov, in which you have, and I've talked to very religious, I interviewed Bais Yaakov girls, and mostly people who are insiders, who talk about that moment in their lives when they could sing their hearts out. That stops, right? When you can't do it anymore, when, in front of men, certainly, and once you start having large families. So there's something very beautiful about the culture of girlhood and the freedoms of girlhood that Bais Yaakov provided to the Orthodox world. And it was my girlhood. I mean, that's who I am. And also the fact that I went to college and studied Hebrew and Yiddish literature, and I basically, my Bais Yaakov education continues to serve me well, and not just this research project, but all my research projects. And I got a serious education. I don't know if everybody who went to Bais Yaakov could say that. And I appreciate that. I mean, what else do I miss? I miss the female camaraderie, the sisterhood, you could call it. Traditional Judaism has a kind of genius for community that the secular world does not have, that I'll never find anymore, that even the most radical lesbian separatists can't reproduce. I think. I mean, maybe they can. I was never in a radical lesbian separatist circle, but I didn't need to be because I was in Bais Yaakov. And
you're always welcome to come up to the Bayit. I'm not sure if we're from enough for you, but you're always welcome to join us if you ever miss community. We'd be delighted to welcome you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If you're not from enough, I don't know.
Well, it's not exactly Borough Park. I mean, but we try to be, we try to have a very broad tent in any way.
Do you let women sing? For me, a main reason I left the Orthodox world was because of that. It still remains an open sore for me, the shutting up of women's voices. I don't care about women's faces, which actually is not a prohibition, halachic prohibition. And I don't blame, Orthodox men. I understand you inherit the rules that you inherit. But for me, that singing was such a big part of what it meant for me to connect to my religion. And it just seems so cruel to have had that closed down. So for me, I would come to the bayit if you let women sing.
Well,
That's my,
we certainly don't stop women from singing. We just we don't have any shlichei tzibur who are women. The
yeah,
shliach tzibur is
that
always
I'm fine with. I mean, the Carlebach rule has the same rule. Women don't sing; they're not soloists, but if they sing together, then they can.
Yeah. You know, my daughter-in-law just did a production here locally for one of the Bais Yaakov schools here, and she does it every year. So I'm going to make sure that she watches this. And
Which one? As I said, I just went to one.
this was for Tiferes Bais Yaakov. I'm not sure.
No.
I'm not sure if that's the one you went to, but
I think I went to the regular BYHS.
okay, all right.
Again, she's firmer than we are, so we're. I would just thank you so much, Professor Seidman. It was really a pleasure. I think we're all trying to navigate, like I would say, just if I could speak for myself, but I think all of us are trying to, in some way, navigate that place where we don't always fit into what, let's say, the institutional box that is cast for us. And I think it's really an incredible service that you've done. There's a lot of singing from the Bais section, it says in the chat. Okay, wonderful.
Beautiful, beautiful. As I said, that's the thing I miss the most. And cholent.
We got plenty of cholent also.
I think you're right. I think that the Orthodox world gains a lot, and the world in general gains a lot from the scholarship that you have contributed to. So we really thank you for that, and thank you for really being so open with us, and really, it was just a pleasure speaking with you. So thank you so much.
And I also want to
thank you so
thank.
much for having me.
Oh, it's really our pleasure. I want to thank Rabbi Lesher for really organizing this. And this really came as a direct result of his giving a series based on your book. So a big yishar koach to him as well. And I want to welcome you to Toronto, because I know that you're still a greener here in Canada. I'm delighted that you got your grant. And we just want to let you know that, as Rabbi Lesher said, it is complicated. And one of the things that I think we pride ourselves at the Bayit is that we don't try to fit into an institutional box. We abide by halacha, but beyond that, we try to be as open as we possibly can to all different walks of Jewish life. And so with that, once again, let me thank you as well. It's just delightful to have you with us. I'm sure that people are going to be talking about this discussion and are going to want to hear more from you. We look forward to seeing your book on Freud. And let me wish you a Chag Kasher V'Sameach to you and your family. And the Bezrat Hashem will continue.
A Freilich und Pesach.
You too. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.